This is a presentation on motivation, specifically on McClellands' three-need theory. So in your book this week, we're talking about leadership trait theories, talking about characteristics of leaders. And in that chapter, they talk about power and achievement. And they talk about power and achievement as behaviors. They talk about them as traits or characteristics of effective leaders. But power and achievement in psychology are not only behavioral concepts. So power and achievement actually represent some psychological underpinnings of why we might behave as we do. So actually power and achievement represents motives or motivation. So motives can be drivers of behavior, but ultimately you're able to intentionally choose your behavior. So we'll talk in a minute about definitions of motives, but basically they are potential sources of satisfaction. And if you are not choosing your behavior intentionally, there's a darn good chance that your behavior will align with your main or your dominant motive. But they don't have to. Motives do not equal behavior. You can choose to behave however you want in a given situation. And in fact, the most effective leaders, the most effective team members don't just behave in alignment with their main or dominant motive, but they in fact choose their behavior to be as effective as possible in any situation. All right, so we are going to be talking about motives and motivation. But first, let's start with a little history. So here's some history, and this is really just to set the context. You don't need to really worry about any of this. But in the 1930s, Henry Murray was a psychologist at Harvard. In fact, he was the director of the psychological clinic there. And in the 1930s, the main theory around personality was in fact focused on trait theory. Most of the research around personality theory was focused on trait theory. And Henry Murray, in his own research, developed what became later known as the need theory of motivation. And so what he did is he developed a test, an assessment, in order to understand what people's motives were, what their underlying concerns, sort of the way that they saw the world was. The problem is that motives and those kinds of underlying concerns are what we refer to as non-conscious. They're not unconscious. We can know them, but most of us don't know what our motives are. If you were just to give someone a paper and pencil test and say, tell me about your motives, they would predict them wrong. So what Murray did is developed a different kind of test in order to really tap into what people's actual motives were. And the name of that test is the thematic apperception test, the TAT. This test, developed in the 1930s, is still in use today. And here's what Murray found out. He found out that if you show people a single frame picture that has at least two people in it and ask them to tell you a story about that picture, what you can do is you can then look back at that story and you can uncover what that person's motives are. And so here's how the TAT, the thematic apperception test, works. So let's say this woman is a psychologist and she is administering the TAT to this other person. So here's the psychologist, here's the person whose motives we are assessing with the TAT. So the psychologist shows the person this single frame picture, asks them to tell a story about the picture, and then the psychologist takes notes as the person's telling their story. After the first picture, the psychologist will show a second picture and ask the person to tell a story and take notes, then a third picture and ask the person to tell a story and take notes. Murray recommends 20 pictures for the thematic apperception test. In modern use, people, I think, tend to use more like 8 to 12 pictures, but again, Murray recommended 20 pictures. After those 20 stories have been told, the person goes away, the psychologist looks through all of those notes, codes the information that's there, and identifies what the motives were that were shown in those stories. It sounds sometimes like it really shouldn't work, but it does. It's a very reliable and valid test that the psychometric work to assess the validity and reliability has been done again and again and again since the 1930s. All right, David McClelland. In the 1960s, David McClelland, who was also a psychologist, joined the faculty at Harvard as a professor, and ultimately he became chairman of the Department of Psychology and Social Relations. And McClelland also did some work on the thematic apperception test to improve it. Specifically, he did some work around increasing the reliability and validity of the scoring of those tests. He also became known for his own research around achievement motivation theory, which is sometimes called the three-need theory and sometimes referred to as the three social motives. So what McClelland ended up doing was coming up with his own version of the thematic apperception test. It's a variation of the TAT. And he did this for several reasons. One of the reasons was he had a concern that the motives of the psychologist, the person who was taking notes, might also be showing up in the notes, as well as the motive of the person telling the story. So in his version of the test, the individuals write their own story so that there's no chance that the psychologist is polluting the data with her own motives. He also reduced the number of stories. He found in his research that after 6 stories, he felt there was no significant difference in the results. So his test has 6 stories. And then the improved scoring of the stories that he began with the thematic apperception test, he continued with his own test. And his test is referred to as the picture story exercise. Again, they're essentially the same tests, just a few differences between the two. Now, before we go on and talk about motivation, here's a little bit of psychology trivia. So some of you might be familiar with Daniel Goleman. Daniel Goleman came up with a model of emotional intelligence. He's written extensively, talked extensively on emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman actually got his PhD in psychology at Harvard while David McClelland was there. So Goleman studied under David McClelland, and in fact, David McClelland was the dissertation advisor for Dan Goleman for his doctoral dissertation. And when Goleman graduated from Harvard, he went to work for David McClelland's company. So the emotional intelligence work that Dan Goleman did, that model that he developed, is influenced from several sources, including the three-need theory of motivation that he experienced while working at David McClelland's company. All right, so now let's go and actually start talking about motives. So first, the definition of a motive. According to Merriam-Webster Dictionary, a motive is something, like a need or a desire, that causes a person to act. Here's a definition that I like to use, kind of a working definition of a motive. And I'm going to read it, and then I want to go over it in pieces. So a motive is a recurrent concern for a goal state. It's based on a natural incentive that energizes, orients, and selects behavior. So let's break that down a little bit. So first of all, a motive is a recurrent concern. So going back to the language of Henry Murray, this really represents a view that you have of the world. This is an ongoing concern. It's not something that you're concerned about on Tuesday or a week from Wednesday. This is always part of you. So I like to think of it, you know how when you're watching television and there's that text that scrolls across the bottom of the screen? I like to think of that as your motive. It's always there every minute of every day as you are experiencing the world. That concern is present. And it's a concern for a goal state. And a goal state is actually a feeling. It's not an activity, it's not an action, but it's the way you feel inside. It's a sense of satisfaction. So imagine, for example, that you're a basketball player and you're out on the court and you're standing at the free throw line and you put the ball up and it just swooshes right through the hoop and you think, that feels great. That's a goal state. Or imagine that you and your teenage son haven't been communicating so well maybe lately because he's a teenager, and you drive him to the mall to meet some of his friends, and on the way to the mall you have a really great conversation. And when he gets out of the car, you think, that was wonderful. Or imagine that you coach your son's soccer team and 6 years old, and instead of bunching around the ball and chasing the ball around the field, finally today they start a little bit spreading out and playing their positions. And you think, that's wonderful. So it's that feeling, that's the goal state. And it's a very satisfying feeling. And it's based on, you'll see in the definition, a natural incentive. And the reason that it's a natural incentive is because it comes from inside you. It's that sense of satisfaction from achieving the goal state that incentivizes you, that has you move and behave in alignment with your motive. You don't need external reinforcement in order to behave this way. You have internal reinforcement. And it's reinforcement that energizes, orients, and selects your behavior. Why does a motive tend to direct your behavior? Because it makes you feel good. So unless you're choosing your behavior intentionally, chances are your behavior is being influenced by your main or your dominant motive. Now, let's talk about McClellands 3-need theory. So McClelland identifies 3 motives: the achievement motive, the affiliation motive, and the power motive. Now, according to McClelland, none of those motives are better than the other, right? No motive is good, no motive is bad. Motives are just potential sources of satisfaction. Now, if you behave out of your motive, it might be effective or not effective given the situation, but the motive itself isn't a behavior. The motive itself is just that sense of satisfaction. So let's talk about each of these 3 motives and what the need or where the energy comes from for the motive. Oh, before I go on, McClelland says everybody has all 3 of these motives, but most of us have a first place, second place, third place. Our first place motive is something that gives us a sense of satisfaction. When we're behaving in alignment with our dominant motive, our first place motive, we get filled with energy. When we are behaving in alignment with our third place motive, we can do those behaviors, but it takes our energy. Instead of giving us energy, it sucks the energy away from us. All right, let's talk about the 3 motives. So the first motive is the achievement motive. And the main concern for someone who has a dominant achievement motive is meeting or exceeding a standard of excellence or improving your own performance. So someone who has an achievement motive is always thinking about setting and accomplishing goals. It's always about where's the bar, where are we setting the bar, and how can that person hit the bar or get over the bar. So the second bullet there is someone who has a dominant achievement motive is concerned to know their progress toward a goal or the results that they're getting toward a goal. Now those results can come from measurements or statistics or business results or from other feedback. So people can give us feedback to let us know how good we're doing against our goals. Now these goals can either be self-determined, I have decided I'm going to get the report done on Thursday, or they can be assigned by other people. So the third bullet is the dominant achievement motive also is concerned about and gets satisfaction from accomplishing something that's new, unique, or innovative. And you'll see I have in parentheses there, better, faster, more efficiently. So the person who has the dominant achievement motive is always looking for ways to do things better, faster, and more efficiently than they have been done before. And then finally, that last bullet, somebody who has a dominant achievement motive has a focus on the task, a focus on meeting or exceeding that standard of excellence more than a focus on people. It's not to say that they're not personable. It's not to say that they don't like people. But when they're working on a task, they're working on a task. And they tend to kind of tune out other people, might prefer to work alone because they think they'll just get it done better, faster, and more efficiently. So that's the achievement motive. Some of you who are listening have a dominant achievement motive. This is the main concern. This is the text that's always scrolling across the television screen that is you. There are, however, two other motives. So the next motive is the affiliation motive. And someone who has a dominant affiliation motive has as their primary concern maintaining close, friendly, reciprocal relationships with other people, or avoiding the disruption of those relationships. So someone who has a dominant affiliation motive is going to be concerned about, no surprise, establishing, maintaining, or restoring close, warm relations, being liked and accepted by the people that they like. Now, someone who has a dominant affiliation motive doesn't like everybody, but they like who they like, and they're concerned that those people like them back, that they're in a relationship with those people. So that second bullet there, being part of a group of people that you like, is important and satisfying to the affiliation motive. The third bullet is another concern that someone who has a dominant affiliation motive has, is avoiding conflict or the disruption of group harmony. So for example, they're likely to be risk averse to something that will disrupt the group harmony, that will disrupt people getting along. They might consider the group or others over themselves. So they might go along versus rocking the boat. Because again, the main concern is making sure that those relationships stay intact. And then the last bullet there, someone who has a dominant affiliation motive is concerned with collaboration more than competition. The idea that there is just one winner is something, or just one first place person, or just one person that gets the credit, is not satisfying to the affiliation motive. The affiliation motive values consensus and collaboration. Now, some of you who are listening to this have a dominant affiliation motive. This is the thing that primarily motivates you and your behavior. Now, the third motive is the power motive. Now, McClellands said at one point in his career that if he could have renamed this, he would have, because people see the word power and they think all kinds of negative things. And again, this isn't negative, this isn't positive, this is just a potential source of satisfaction. So if it helps you, think about this as the influence motive. So the main concern for someone who has the power or influence motive is in fact having an influence on others or making an impact on others. So someone who has the power influence motive as their dominant motive is concerned about influencing others or controlling others. Often this person will arouse strong positive or negative emotions in others. People will be grateful for their influence, or they might be resentful of their influence. One thing that I don't have on the screen here, but people who have a dominant power motive sometimes give unsolicited advice, because that's a way to influence someone. Because again, if I'm dominant power motive, the satisfaction for me comes from influencing other people, whether you've asked me for my advice or not. All right, going back to the third bullet on the screen, another thing that the person who is the dominant power and influence motive is concerned about or thinks about is status and recognition. Because status, right, I went to the opening of the art gallery. I went golfing with the president of the university. Those are a way to make an impact on others, to have an influence on others, or recognition. I got an award from the Chamber of Commerce for something. That's a way to make an impact on others or to have an influence on others. And then finally, that fourth bullet, competition, where in fact there is a winner, is something that is very satisfying to the power motive. Being the winner, being in first place, is a way to have an influence or make an impact on others. Some of you who are listening are dominant power motive. You get your satisfaction, you get your energy from influencing other people. Now, sometimes when people read through this, they go to the dark side of the power motive. So I do want to talk about two variations of the power motive. We sometimes talk about socialized power and personalized power. Socialized power is where I influence someone or have an impact on someone for the purpose of making them stronger and more capable. So I'm influencing you to make you better. I'm influencing you to make you strong, to make you capable. Personalized power is where I influence or have an impact for the purpose of making me look stronger and more capable. So I influence you to make me look better. So when you think about power, sometimes it's helpful to think about the difference between socialized and personalized power. Now, when people take McClellands' test, when they take his picture story exercise, it doesn't tell you if you're socialized power or personalized power, but really what is behind these two kinds of power is the intent, right? Why are you influencing people? Are you influencing people to make them better, or are you influencing people to make yourself better? So those are the three motives. We all have all three. Most of us have a first place, second place, third place. Our first place motive, unless we choose our behavior intentionally, likely to drive our behavior. Why? Because it makes us feel good. It gives us a sense of satisfaction and energy when we behave in a way that satisfies or aligns with our dominant motive. So, why do we even care about motives? Why am I bothering to tell you all this? Well, another psychologist in the 1930s, Kurt Lewin, came up with this formula. And his formula is that your behavior, anyone's behavior, is a function of who they are as a person and the environment that they find themselves in. And so this is often abbreviated B equals a function of P and E. Behavior is a function of the person and the environment. So my behavior is a function of who I am as a person and the environment that I'm in. Somebody else's behavior is a function of who they are as a person and the environment that they're in. And the formula makes a lot of sense when you think about it, right? You're one person, and if you find yourself in 100 different situations, you're likely to behave 100 different ways. Or if you take 100 people and put them in exactly the same situation, they're likely to behave in a bunch of different ways. So another way to say this formula is to say that the person and the environment influence the behavior of a person. So when I say person, really I'm talking about the individual competencies of that person, everything that makes up that person. It's their education, it's their beliefs, it's their experiences, it's their family, it's the country they grew up in, it's if they're a man or a woman, it's their values, and it's their motives. So if I have a dominant motive of achievement, if my main concern is meeting or exceeding a standard of excellence, unless I choose differently, that's going to influence my behavior. If my dominant motive is affiliation, if my main concern is those closely connected relationships, unless I choose my behavior intentionally, that's likely to influence my behavior. And then finally, if my dominant motive is power and influence, if my concern is having an influence on other people, unless I choose my behavior intentionally, chances are that power motive is going to influence my behavior. So who I am as a person and all the experiences and education I've had up to this point, plus the environment or the situation that I'm in, both of those things are going to influence my behavior. All right, let's get rid of the bottom of the screen for a minute and focus back at the top. So this is a class, of course, on leadership. So it's also true that a leader's behavior is a function of who she is as a person and the environment that she's in. So if we look back at the bottom of the screen where we left off, we can also say that a leader, who a leader is as a person, her individual competencies, including her motives, and the environment that she's in, influences her behavior as a leader. So for a leader, when we're talking about environment, we're really talking about job requirements and the general workplace environment. Is it a collaborative environment? Is it a high-stress environment? Is it very competitive? Are people overworked? Are people disgruntled? Right? What's the general workplace environment? Who that leader is as a person and the environment in which she finds herself influences her behaviors as a leader. And when we're talking about leader behaviors, we very often refer to them as leadership styles. Now, we're specifically going to be talking about leadership styles later in the class, but know that basically what we're talking about are the behaviors of a leader. All right, I'm going to get rid of the bottom of the screen again. So looking back at the top, it's true that the behavior of a leader is a function of who she is as a person and the environment that she's in. But leaders don't behave in a vacuum. There's also employees there. And it's also true that an employee's behavior is a function of who he is as a person and the environment in which he finds himself. So the question is, what's the relationship between that first line, that first equation, and the second equation? How does the leader's behavior impact the employee? And the way that the leader's behavior impacts the employee is that the leader's behavior is part of the environment in which the employee works. So going back to the bottom of the screen, we have the leader, so we have the person and the environment contribute to the behavior of that leader, but then we also have the impact of that behavior. And the impact of that leader's behavior shows up in the employee's environment, in the workplace in which the employee is working. Now, there's lots of ways that we can look at employees' environment. We can look at culture, we can look at engagement, but I want to introduce a concept called organizational climate. And I like organizational climate because it's a localized measure. That is to say, the behavior of the leader is the single greatest contributor to organizational climate. It's not the only contributor to organizational climate, but it's the greatest contributor to organizational climate. So what is organizational climate? Organizational climate is how it feels to work for a particular leader. It's the things in the environment that contribute to the employee's willingness and ability to do whatever it is they're supposed to do. So in a more effective organizational climate, an employee is willing and able to do their job. In a less effective organizational climate, the employee's willingness or ability to do what they're supposed to do is compromised. One of the other reasons that I like using organizational climate as a measurement for the employee's environment is because research has been done to statistically correlate various aspects or dimensions of organizational climate with results. So there's been research that's been done since about the 1960s or 70s that show a relationship between the various dimensions of organizational climate and results. And in fact, in many studies, what they have found is that the more effective climate has an impact of as much as 30% on the results that are obtained by an organization, which kind of makes sense. If you have employees who are willing and able to do what they're supposed to do, it just stands to reason they're going to get better results. And on the flip side, if you have employees who are unwilling or unable to do what they're supposed to do, it just stands to reason that that's going to have a negative impact on results. And when I talk about results, here's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an actual increase in performance. So we sell more stuff. We have higher scores on our customer satisfaction survey, right? The actual performance measures go up. But it's also about an increase in innovation. It's an increase in people's ability to try new things and do things in better ways. And it's also about an increase in discretionary effort. And when I say discretionary effort, what I'm referring to is the difference between what people are capable of giving performance-wise and what they're actually giving. So I'm not talking about how do you get employees to work 150%. I'm talking about how do you get them to give 100% of what they're capable of. So this is why we care about motives. We care about motives because our motives impact potentially our leadership behaviors or our leadership styles, which impact the environment that our employees work in, which impacts their willingness and ability to do whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, and that has an impact on results. So that's why we care about motives. So just to wrap it up, one more slide. Let's talk about your motives and the motives of others. And in fact, I'm going to go ahead and tie it to emotional intelligence. So I know many of you are familiar with Goleman's emotional intelligence model. Here's just a quick recap for those of you who are not familiar with it. It's a 2x2 model, as you see on the screen here. The top row is about awareness, and the bottom row is about action. The left-hand column is about self, it's about you, and the right-hand column is about others. So as we populate those 4 squares, we see in the upper left corner self-awareness. Then moving down, we see self-management. That's the action part of self-awareness. Moving to the right-hand column, we see social awareness, awareness of others. And then moving to the final square, we see relationship management, which is the action piece. It's now that you understand yourself as well as the needs and concerns of others, how do you make that, how do you navigate that successfully to get done what you need to get done? So from a motive standpoint, understanding our own motives, self-awareness, I know what my own motive is, I understand what motivates me, is a very effective tool. And it's an effective tool because then I can self-manage myself. If my dominant motive is achievement, and I behave 100% of the time out of my achievement motive, I will not be effective 100% of the time. If my dominant motive is affiliation and I behave 100% of the time out of the affiliation motive, I will not be effective 100% of the time. And if my dominant motive is the power and influence motive and I behave out of that motive 100% of the time, I will not be effective 100% of the time. In order to be effective 100% of the time, we need to behave from each of those 3 motives, whether it's a motive that gives us a bunch of internal satisfaction or not. So really the self-management piece is all about choosing the behavior that's going to be most effective in any given situation, whether it's our dominant motive or not. Because our motives do not equal behavior. They do not have to equal behavior. We can choose to behave however we want. But if we don't choose, chances are we're going to behave out of our dominant motive. So up until now, everything I've talked about really has been in that left-hand column. It's really been all about us. But you can also use motives as you think about other people. So it can be very effective from a social awareness standpoint to understand the motives of others. And even if you don't know what their motives are, it's just very helpful to understand there's people who are motivated by things that are different from you. I joke around and say the saddest day of my life is when I realized I wasn't the center of the universe. And it sounds silly when you say it that way. I think I'm the center of the universe. But many of us lead as if we're the center of the universe. We think that everybody's motivated by what we're motivated by. We think everybody's rewarded in the way that we like to be rewarded. We think everyone likes to be communicated to the way that we like to be communicated to. We think everybody's influenced the way that we're influenced, and that's not true. So even if you just use McClellands 3 motives to say, okay, I think I'm this one, but I know that the other people that I work with are bound to be not just the one I think I am, but these other motives, that's really going to help your social awareness as a leader. And then finally, relationship management, you use that knowledge that there are other motives, there are other ways to get energy, to get satisfaction, to view the world different from the way that you do, especially when it comes to communication, for you to create clarity with others and as you influence people. So I can tell you personally that once I started to learn about motives, which was, 25 years ago or something, I became 1,000 times more effective as an influencer, because now I'm not just influencing people from my own motive, but I'm influencing to all 3 of those motives. So in summary, here's a little bit of background on motives and what motivates people according to David McClelland. If you're interested in any of these concepts that we talked about, because I know I blew through a lot here, so if you want to learn more about motives, if you want to learn more about organizational climate, if you want to learn more about Goleman's emotional intelligence, if you want to know more about creating clarity or influencing or any of that stuff, just let me know and I will do my best to work it into something this semester so that we can have that conversation.